Okay, that's not a misprint. The familiar phrase, the more familiar phrase, united we stand, divided we fall, has been around at least as far back as when Aesop used it as the moral of a story about the 4 oxen and a lion. And the oxen survive the lion's frequent attacks by turning their tails inward towards one another so that whichever way it approaches, it's always met with their horns. But after quarreling amongst themselves and separating, the lion soon puts an end to all of the unfortunate oxen. The moral of the story, united we stand, divided we fall, has been around ever since to encourage unity, especially among groups, large and small, struggling together for some common cause, like war, national freedom, individual freedom, labor rights, voting rights, and so on. The idea is sometimes attributed to Abraham Lincoln, who once gave a speech in which he actually quoted the Gospel of Mark, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." Something similar is said in the Gospel of Matthew, that every kingdom divided against itself will be ruined, and every city or household divided against itself will not stand. And these verses show that this assumption that people must be united if they are going to endure is an ancient one and was widespread. And it's a powerful idea, but paradoxically, it's almost always used to encourage solidarity among one group by being divided against another group. It is a call for unity among insiders by dividing against outsiders. It's the idea that those who are not for us are against us. So it isn't really about the greater principle of unity. It's kind of euphemistic, a euphemistic use of unity, but about struggling together against a common foe for a period. And such unity then needs an enemy and is rooted in division. And with such a limited purpose, any unity resulting from such motivation will only be temporary. Once the common threat ends, and the unity will begin to end too, and the group that had been held together by that threat will start to separate, perhaps to the point of smaller internal groups uniting to stand against those with whom they had once been united. Sound like a familiar situation? Just a few weeks ago, Justin Trudeau, Canada's Prime Minister, of course, since 2015, announced his impending resignation. Trudeau, leader of the nation's Liberal Party, has become extremely unpopular, and the polls indicated the very strong likelihood that Canada would elect its own version of a Donald Trump-like conservative populist in Trudeau's place. But in just a short time, after Trump's insulting remarks and attacks on their sovereignty and economy, Canadians have become unified around their national identity, Canada first, with its chief nemesis being the American president and his government. So far, they're still talking very nicely about the rest of us, thank goodness, but they don't like the president. Fed up with Trump, and anyone who thinks, talks, or acts like him has flipped the polls, which almost now assure that the next Canadian Prime Minister will be from the Liberal Party once again. So the question is, what is going to happen to their sense of unity and nationalism if and once the Trump threat ends? Will Canadian society return to the kind of political division that is typical of most Western nations today, either putting authoritarians or on the verge of putting authoritarians into place? United we stand, divided we fall also implies that to be united, everyone must be on the same page. They must agree and think alike. It's a call for authoritarianism and groupthink, Every kingdom divided against itself will be ruined, and every city or household divided against itself will not stand. When played out, this has historically meant that there must be a head of the household, a chain of command, a sovereign authority that cannot be questioned. Hail to the king. Under such circumstances, we will lose the right to think and speak and act for ourselves, either by fear or force, or as in the case with Vladimir Putin's Russia, or with Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un's government of North Korea, or worse, by choice. Because in order to feel like we belong and are part of something larger than ourselves, we stop thinking for ourselves and blindly and cultishly follow and obey whoever is in charge. There's something instinctive in us that wants to join with others by becoming obedient, to be accepted by being obedient, just as we are trained and taught from the very beginning to obey our parents, listen to our teachers, follow the rules, abide by the laws. And this is how we can ensure that we will be loved and rewarded and accepted by others in our society. In his book on disobedience, social psychologist Erich Fromm wrote, "The child just expresses himself, but from the first day of his life onward, he is filled with an unholy respect for conformity, with the fear of being different, with the fright of being away from the rest of the herd." That's how we're raised. If most of the rules imposed upon us in childhood are with the intention of keeping us safe from harm, be they legitimate, like look both ways before crossing the street, especially a good rule to follow, or foolishness, like believe in Jesus or you will go to hell, then we are also likely to grow up to believe that doing what is expected of us will keep us safe, and it will guarantee our place in society. But this type of unity with others is a double-edged sword because it requires us to relinquish our authentic power to think and to question. Freedom and the capacity for disobedience are inseparable, Fromm says. And at this point in history, the capacity to doubt and to disobey may be all that stands before a future for mankind and the end of civilization. Perhaps we see such an end happening today in the good old USA, which contains the principle of unity in its very name. It also refers to the maintenance of now 50 separate states, the United States of America. And these 50 states further, and the country that they belong to, are considered separate from 35 other countries that also share America, the American continent, which together contain nearly 15% of the world's population. The United States of America represents just a little over 4% of the world's population. Yet we have chosen a xenophobic and authoritarian leader who promises America first, to make America great again at the expense of our friendships and our relationships around the world. Just 4.3% of the population first. That's selfish. Even at the exclusion of those outsiders who were just a few days ago among our greatest allies. It has become difficult to believe that the United States of America has really ever been sincerely devoted to the principle of unity. In its 250-year history, of fighting to separate, it has been fighting to separate or to maintain its separation. It has succeeded best at this when facing a common external foe, proving amazingly victorious in the American Revolution, 2 world wars, and the threat of nuclear annihilation during the Cold War. But it has also been torn apart constantly with much civil unrest, including a brutal civil war, and today continues to experience domestic conflict and sometimes terrorism over its old patterns of segregation and inequalities based on race, sex, and class, not to mention the ideological warfares and the identity warfare that we're now in. And because other people who share this same continent have sought to come to the USA in pursuit of a better life, maintaining the integrity of U.S. borders has remained a constant struggle, so worrisome that to some that's one of the major reasons that Donald Trump was elected to a second term in office. He was elected, that is, because of his promise to segregate us from the world, not upon a principle of unity, unless it is merely to be united with him by giving our minds and our wills over to him, which is what he commonly refers to as a love fest. The historic struggle between state rights and federal authority has also escalated since this grand experiment started in 1776, when its citizens successfully began uniting against British rule. The U.S. Constitution is a delicate agreement protecting the rights and a certain degree of autonomy from the federal government. States can choose their own kind of government, and any powers not given to the federal government are reserved for the states. And each state, no matter how small its population, has the same number of U.S. senators, allowing those representing a minority to band together and overrule those representing a majority of the nation's citizens. And there were only 13 states when this agreement was made. Today there are 50, which means we now are a nation of 50 different governments, one nation of multiple dividing lines. During his inaugural speech in 1980, President Ronald Reagan, the man who had been elected to rule, or at least run, I should say, the federal government, said government is not the solution to our problems. Government is the problem. That's the kind of president we need. The Republican Party has ever since worked to weaken federal programs and regulations to reduce taxes and to prevent spending on most programs, including new programs, no matter how vital they are to the welfare and protection of ordinary citizens, as well as of our states. The U.S. now has the most expensive healthcare system on the planet, despite millions of its citizens remaining underinsured or completely uninsured. Despite being the second largest producer of greenhouse gases in the world, though less than 5% of the global population, the U.S. has done little or nothing to address this existential threat. Today, in just his first weeks back in office, President Trump's actions have been directed towards the sole purpose of dismantling the federal government. By firing millions of federal employees across the board and attempting to weaken or entirely eliminate some of our federal agencies, from USAID, the agency responsible for helping those outside our borders or beyond our borders, to the Education Department, which assures public schools are following the laws meant to protect students and teachers from discrimination, and that guarantee education for those with disabilities, among other responsibilities. Trump even wants to eliminate paper straws so we can just return to the plastic straws. It's just further thumbing his nose at even the smallest attempt to protect our planet and our nation from the terrible impacts of climate change that every state in the country is already feeling. All of this suggests that including the principle of unity in the U.S.'s very name is more about maintaining its separation from the rest of the world. Today, as the White House eviscerates federal programs and threatens to withhold assistance to those states whose governments it disagrees with, the states of America may have to find novel ways to fend for themselves. For futurist Paul Sappho, a technology forecaster and consulting professor in the School of Engineering at Stanford University, the situation has long been foreseeable. During a 2007 lecture, for example, Sappho predicted there's less than a 50% chance that the United States will exist by the middle of this century. And I heard him repeat this claim myself during a more recent 2020 lecture, and I'm not going to go into his reasoning for this forecast, but will only point out that it is now 2025, which means if he is correct, we should already be seeing, I should say, the signs of its demise right now. I will leave it up to you to decide if you do or not. The point that I do want to make now is that its demise will not be from its lack of unity, but because of its lack of diversity. Its unwillingness, that is, to tolerate differences. And that's what is driving us apart. For a nation, a group, even a family endures by tolerating its differences, not by forcing everyone to agree and obey, by excluding or punishing those who don't. In recent years, however, I've been surprised by how intolerant even many liberals are toward the idea of tolerance. I get more pushback about my promotion of tolerance than anything else. On one hand, we now have those on the extreme left attacking the reputations, the character, the motives, and even the livelihoods of anyone who questions their ideas of a particular approach to social justice. They use ad hominem fallacies rather than engaging in rational discussions about their claims, which is probably because their ideas are rationally indefensible. On the other hand, there are those who complain that tolerance doesn't go far enough, that we must love one another and fully embrace our differences. In my view, this is also irrational. Why? Firstly, there are 8 billion people in the world, making it impossible for anyone to have the time to fully understand where every person they encounter is coming from. Secondly, how can we be expected to fully embrace every belief that we encounter, even if we could understand everyone? I need only cite the examples of Nazism, white nationalism, Scientology. Apologize to the Scientologist. Reducing inflation and tariffs, and using plastic straws to make the point. There's good reason for us not to embrace many, perhaps most, of the ideas that we encounter, because they are bad ideas. It should be remembered that the principle of tolerance, which means living peacefully among those with whom we differ, is one of the few defining principles of liberalism. It is difficult for us to claim that we are liberal if we are not in support of tolerance. Although the saying, live and let live, has much earlier roots, for example, it only became prominent in English during the Enlightenment, when liberalism was born. Prior to this, tolerance was considered a bad word, even a crime. Throughout most of human history, and sadly, in much of the world today, people have believed that holding different beliefs would lead to civil unrest and conflict, and that calling for tolerance was akin to disloyalty and a call for anarchy. There were places it was a crime. It has been only after long periods of brutality and bloodshed during failed attempts to maintain but one idea that some have begun to utter this forbidden word, tolerance. And the Unitarians were ahead of the curve, becoming the first religion in history to enact a religious toleration law, the Edict of Torda, in 1568. right, during the Renaissance. And sadly, the Unitarian king of Transylvania who enacted this edict died soon thereafter, and the Catholics then took his throne and passed an anti-innovation law, which forbade or made it illegal to express any new religious ideas, resulting in the arrest and imprisonment of Unitarian Bishop Ferenc David, who was really architect of the Edict of Torda. He died in a dungeon beneath the castle of Diva only 6 months later. It would be another century, more than another century, during the Enlightenment that societies and nations would reconsider the taboo notion of tolerance. In the U.S., this eventually resulted in its own such edict. Do you know what that edict was? The First Amendment of its Constitution. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's what the Edict of Torda was about. And furthermore, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or of the right of people peacefully to assemble or to petition the government for a redress of grievances. 175 years later, this principle would be reiterated and expanded in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, banning discriminatory practices in employment and ending segregation in public places like swimming pools, libraries, and above all, public education, public schools. In 1965, a year later, the Voting Rights Act was passed, banning discriminatory practices that were preventing black people from accessing the voting booths, the polls, especially in southern states. And later still, in response to the assassination of Dr. King, another such law was enacted prohibiting discrimination in housing based on race, as well as religion, sex, national origin, or disability. Now notice that all of these efforts to create a tolerant society began with laws, not love. During a 1965 speech at UCLA, Dr. King said, "It may be true that you can't legislate integration, but you can legislate desegregation. It may be true that morality cannot be legislated, but behavior can be regulated. It may be true that the law cannot change the heart, but it can restrain the heartless. It may be true that the law can't make a man love me, but it can restrain him from lynching me." And I think that's pretty important also. And that's what makes tolerance so important and practical a principle, because it can be enforced. Sure, some people will break the laws, but they're less inclined to. It is a social tool meant to help keep the peace, even if we don't understand, nor love, nor even like one another. It is the basis of a civil society, of a peaceful and civil society. And over time, as we find ourselves living in the same neighborhoods, going to the same schools, shopping in the same stores, eating in the same restaurants, and drinking from the same water fountains, working in the same places, we'll discover that our differences aren't very important, and that as human beings, we all deserve to be treated with respect and dignity, and that we have far more in common than not. And hopefully over time, we will even come to befriend and to love one another. But such love is not required. That's too hard. We just need to live and let live. That's the easy part. We only have to tolerate each other. In a world of differences, toleration is far more useful and practical than love. As proven by the failure of Christianity to establish heaven on earth, after 2,000 years of trying, claiming that God is love and that we must love one another. How's that worked out? In his 2006 book, In Defense of the Enlightenment, Tzvetan Todorov says that during the European Age of Enlightenment, the status of our differences were taken as the basis of unity, not isolating one attribute to impute on all. He said this could be done by fostering tolerance and emulation, the free exercise of the critical spirit, and the self-detachment that enables individuals to see things from another's standpoint and attain thereby a level of generality that includes all viewpoints. Yet he goes on to remind us this understanding was not a gift from heaven. It came with a high price tag. Before being the continent, that embodies tolerance and mutual recognition, Europe was the site of painful divisions, murderous conflicts, and incessant wars. This long experience, etched in its memory, in its narratives, in its buildings, and even in its landscapes, is the tribute it had to pay to be able to benefit many years later from peace. After visiting enlightened England, Voltaire once remarked, "Were there but one religion in England, its despotism would be fearful. Were there but two, they would cut each other's throats. But there are 30, and they live in peace and happiness." In contrast, Todorov notes that China, once inventive and creative, this massive continent, once inventive and creative, was thwarted by the emergence of one unified empire where minds were dulled, he says, by the uncontested reign of authority. Contrary to the old saying, united we stand, divided we fall, sorry, I've lost my spot here. Contrary to that saying, he says, here it is in division that there is strength. It is in division that there is strength. Imagine if we called ourselves the divided states of America. And all of this leads me to my main point, and I'll start to wrap up because it's getting close to being too late. That we have to flip this script. It's not by being united that we stand, but by being divided. By recognizing and accepting, that is, that we live in a world of differences. And it is our ideas of unity and sameness, and worse, our attempts to force everyone around us to accept our ideas and our beliefs about truth and politics, religion, justice, and so forth, that actually produce the hate and the hostility, the conflict and the injustice, and that prevents us from progressing and achieving together humanity's full potential and greatness. Dr. King did not dream of a world where we march lockstep, like some great military force directed by one command, one mind, one uncontested reign of authority. He understood that we must join hands and walk together with those who are different from us if we are truly going to progress and establish a more peaceful and just society and world for everyone. He understood that the rigidity that comes with unity eventually causes a society to shatter, as is happening today, and that it is by accepting our differences, by tolerating one another, and to live and let live, to think and let think, to speak and let speak, that we shall prosper and endure.